The Sumerian tablet that describes what lives between the dome and the ocean. Above it, there is a clay tablet sitting in a museum collection that is over 4,000 years old, and if you read it carefully, not as mythology, not as primitive superstition, but as a literal cosmological description written by people who believed they were recording observable fact, it describes a universe so strange and so internally consistent that it has unsettled scholars for generations. It describes a dome above the earth made of solid material, possibly tin. It describes an ocean above that dome, vast and primordial, pressing down from outside the sky. It describes the space between the ast, earth, and the dome as a living, inhabited zone, a middle realm filled with breath, with wind, with divine beings who occupy the air the way fish occupy the sea. And it describes, in specific and repeated detail, exactly what lived there. Not metaphor, not poetry. A populated cosmic architecture, written in cuneiform by scribes who had inherited a tradition of observational record-keeping going back to the earliest city-states on Earth. This is not fringe history. This is the mainstream cosmological framework of the civilization that invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and urban life. And the closer you look at what the tablets actually say, the harder it becomes to dismiss. The Sumerians were the first literate civilization in human history. They emerged in the river valleys of what is now southern Iraq, sometime around 4500 BCE, built the first cities, Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, Ur, and developed the first writing system, cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus and baked into a permanence that has lasted longer than almost any other human record. These were not simple people. They were mathematicians who worked in base 60, a numerical system whose legacy survives today in the 60 seconds of a minute and the 60 minutes of an hour. They were astronomers who tracked the movements of planets across decades and built predictive models that were accurate enough to anticipate eclipses. They were lawyers who codified the Code of Ur-Nammu, the oldest written legal document in human history, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries. When they wrote about the structure of the universe, they were not writing fiction. They were recording a cosmological framework that they understood as true, that their priests studied, that their astronomers used as the foundation for tracking the movements of celestial bodies, and that their kings consulted as the organizing structure of political and religious authority. The cosmology of the Sumerians was their science. It was as serious and as carefully maintained as any system of knowledge their civilization produced. And it described a universe that looks, to modern eyes, absolutely extraordinary. The foundation of Sumerian cosmology, reconstructed by scholars including the great Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer from hymns, myths, creation epics, incantation texts, and administrative records, spread across dozens of clay tablets, is this. Before anything existed, there was only Nammu, the primordial saltwater sea. Not water as a substance, but water as the total state of reality, undifferentiated, without boundary, without interior or exterior, without above or below. From Nammu, 2 children were born, An, who became the sky, and Kai, who became the earth. In the beginning, An and Ki were joined together, pressed against one another, a single mass of heaven and earth in the darkness of the primordial sea. Then Enlil was born from their union, the god of wind and breath, whose name literally means Lord Wind, and it was Enlil who drove them apart. He forced heaven upward and earth downward, and in the space between them, the universe, as the Sumerians knew it, came into existence. That space between heaven and earth was where all life happened. That space was where the Sumerians lived, where the sun and moon traveled, where the stars burned, where the gods conducted their affairs. And it was not empty. The sky in this cosmological framework, the dome that An had become, was described in Sumerian texts as a solid vault. The word the Sumerians used for tin, the metal, was metal of heaven. And scholars, including Kramer, concluded from this and other textual evidence that the solid firmament of the sky was believed to be made of tin, or something like it. This was not ignorance. The Sumerians knew metals. They worked bronze. They understood material properties. When they described the sky as a solid dome made of a heavenly metal, they were making a specific claim about the physical nature of the boundary above them, and that claim was consistent across centuries of religious and astronomical literature. The sky was not an opening into infinite space. The sky was a ceiling. It was the underside of heaven itself, the great dome of An, and above it pressed the upper waters, the celestial ocean that had existed before creation, the remnant of Nammu's primordial sea that had not been enclosed within the world but continued to surround it from above and below and on all sides. This is the cosmological architecture that requires the most careful attention, because it is the part that the tablets describe with the greatest specificity and the part that raises the most profound questions. The universe, in Sumerian understanding, was a closed system, a bubble inside an infinite surrounding, ocean. The dome of the sky held back the upper waters from above. The deep freshwater ocean, the Abzu, lay beneath the flat disk of the earth and held it up from below. And surrounding everything, the earth, the Abzu beneath it, the dome of and above it, the entire enclosed world, was the endless salt water of Namu, pressing in from every direction. The world was not a planet floating in space. The world was an air pocket inside an ocean. This distinction matters more than it might initially appear, because the cosmological implications of a world surrounded by water rather than by void are profound. Rain was not weather. It was the upper ocean leaking through the dome's gates. The flooding of rivers was not hydrology. It was the Abzu surging upward through the ground. Every encounter between the human world and water was an encounter with the primordial stuff from which the cosmos itself had been made. And the things that lived in that air pocket, between the earth below and the dome above, were not random or undefined. They were named, described, ranked, and categorized with the same bureaucratic precision the Sumerians applied to everything else. The most important being who inhabited the space between earth and sky was Enlil himself. As the god who had separated An from Ki, who had, in effect, created the space between heaven and earth by forcing them apart, Enlil was the natural ruler of that space. He was the atmosphere. He was the breath. The Sumerians used a word for the substance of this middle realm, lil, that translators render as wind, air, breath, or spirit. Its defining characteristics, as scholars have noted, were movement and expansion. Lil was not simply air in the mechanical sense. It was the animating principle of the space. Between the dome and the earth, the medium through which divine will moved, the substance that connected the highest heavens to the ground beneath human feet. Enlil was not merely a god who controlled wind. He was, in a very real sense, the wind itself, the personification and the lord of the entire atmospheric space that existed between the tin vault of An and the flat disk of Kai. According to one remarkable Sumerian hymn, Enlil himself was so holy that not even the other gods could look upon him directly. He was the invisible substance of the world made divine. But Enlil was not the only being who lived in this space. The texts describe a complex, layered population of divine and semi-divine entities that inhabited different levels of the middle realm, each with specific functions, specific appearances, and specific relationships to the human world below and the heavenly world above. At the highest level of the cosmic hierarchy, occupying the space immediately adjacent to the dome of An, were the Anunnaki, a group of major deities whose name is often translated as those of royal blood, or the offspring of An. The Anunnaki, in their most ancient Sumerian form, were the great gods of heaven and earth, the children of the union between sky and ground, beings of enormous power who presided over the fundamental forces of the cosmos. They were not entirely above. They were in the space between, governing from the middle realm, attending the court of Enlil, receiving the prayers of humans from below and transmitting them upward toward An. In the tablets, only Enlil had direct access to An, the sky god who sat at the absolute top of the divine hierarchy. Everyone else communicated through the layers of the middle realm. Then there were the Igigi, a distinct group described in Sumerian and Akkadian texts as the younger gods, associated with the heavens, who labored for the great Anunnaki. The relationship between the Igigi and the Anunnaki changed across different periods of Mesopotamian literature, sometimes describing them as subordinates, sometimes as co-equal but separate classes of divine being. What remained consistent was their location. They inhabited the upper portions of the middle realm, closer to the dome of An, closer to the upper waters, existing in a zone of the atmosphere that ordinary human beings could never reach. The Igigi appear in the great flood myth Atrahasis as the beings whose complaints about their labor led to the creation of humanity. The gods grew tired of digging the rivers and maintaining the earth themselves, and so the decision was made to create humans as substitutes, beings of clay and divine blood who would take over the work of maintaining the world. This is one of the oldest labor origin myths in human history, and it is set explicitly in the layered cosmological architecture of the middle realm. The Igigi, laboring in the heavenly space above, their work eventually outsourced to the clay creatures living on the flat earth below. Occupying yet another layer of the middle realm were the Apkallu, the seven sages, described in Sumerian tradition as being sent by Enki from the Abzu at the beginning of time to bring civilization to humanity. The Apkallu are among the most visually specific beings in all of Sumerian mythology. They were depicted in art with the body of a fish and the head of a man, or with a human torso and fishtail, sometimes with wings, always carrying a bucket and a cone of incense for purification. Their Akkadian name, as recorded in tablets from the World History Encyclopedia, was also rendered as the Abgal. 7 cosmic sages who delivered the sacred me, the divine laws that governed civilization, to the earliest human communities. They moved between worlds. They came from the underground waters of the Abzu, passed through the earth, entered the middle realm of air and Lil, and taught the people of Sumer writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, and law. After their work was done, they returned, not upward to the heavens, but back down through the earth into the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the world. Their trajectory was vertical in both directions, moving freely through the layered cosmological structure in ways that humans could not. Then there was Anzu, perhaps the most dramatic and terrifying being described in the Middle Realm, a creature so powerful that its mere existence unsettled the entire cosmic order. Anzu, also known as Imdugud in earlier Sumerian texts, was a divine storm bird of extraordinary scale, depicted as an eagle with the head of a lion, capable of breathing fire and water simultaneously. Anzu inhabited the upper atmosphere, the zone closest to the dome where the most violent weather originated, where thunder was born, where the wind came down from the south and the storms that scoured the Mesopotamian plains. In the Epic of Anzu, this creature was entrusted as a servant to Enlil himself, brought into the divine court of the Middle Realm, given access to Enlil's most sacred possessions, and ultimately betrayed that trust in an act of cosmic rebellion that shook the entire structure of the universe. The specific object Anzu stole was the Tablet of Destinies, the divine record on which the fates of gods and men were written, the object that conferred supreme authority over all of existence on whoever held it. Anzu took it during a moment of Enlil's vulnerability, when the god had removed it to bathe and fled into the mountains with the entire order of the cosmos disrupted behind him. Without the Tablet of Destinies, the machinery of fate stopped. The gods were paralyzed, and himself ordered that someone must retrieve it, but every god approached was too afraid to face Anzu directly. It took Ninurta, the warrior god, armed with divine arrows and guided by the wisdom of Enki, to finally bring Anzu down. The tablets describe the battle in careful detail. Arrows fired, commands to the arrows to stop the creature's breathing, the bird falling, the tablet recovered, and the world's order restored. What is remarkable about this myth is not merely its narrative drama, it is the consistent, specific placement of these events in the Middle Realm, in the atmospheric space between the earth and the dome, where Anzu lived, where the Stormbird had always lived, and where the battle for the destiny of the universe took place. The dome itself, the solid ceiling of the world, was not a passive architectural feature in Sumerian cosmology. It was a boundary actively maintained by divine force, a structured barrier between the breathable Middle Realm and the crushing waters above it. The texts describe windows and gates in the dome, specific openings through which the sun god Utu, also known as Shamash in Akkadian, entered and exited the visible sky each day. Each morning, according to hymns compiled from multiple tablets, Utu rose from the interior of heaven through gates in the east, crossed the firmament with rays shining from his shoulders, traveled across the dome through the middle realm of air, and then descended through corresponding gates in the west into the underworld, becoming one of its luminaries through the hours of darkness before rising again at dawn. The moon god Nana made a similar journey, though at a different pace and on a different schedule, tracing a path across the dome that the Sumerian astronomers tracked with extraordinary precision over months and years. The movement of celestial bodies across the dome was not random. It was governed by the divine administrative structure of the Middle Realm, each heavenly traveler assigned a route, a speed, and a purpose by the gods who managed the architecture of the world. This daily passage was not metaphorical. It was a description of a mechanical cosmological process, the sun and moon moving through a specific physical architecture of gates, domes, and layered realms in repeating cycles that were the fundamental rhythms of existence. Above the dome, the upper waters pressed down in silence. The texts do not describe what lived in those waters directly. That realm was above and beyond the world, the territory of An himself, too remote and too divine for detailed description. But the existence of those waters was not questioned. They were the source of rain, which in Sumerian understanding came through the windows of heaven when the gates were opened, the upper ocean above the dome releasing its water down through the barrier and into the middle realm, where it fell to earth. This is why rain was understood as a divine gift requiring divine action. It was not a weather system. It was water from above the dome, admitted through gates, controlled by gods, given to the earth in sufficient measure or withheld in punishment. The famous flood myths of Mesopotamia, including the flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the earlier Eridu Genesis, describe the catastrophe not as extraordinary rainfall, but as the opening of all the windows of heaven simultaneously. The upper ocean above the dome pouring through the gates at full force, the lower waters of the Abzu surging up from beneath, the middle realm of air briefly overwhelmed as the boundaries between the three cosmic regions collapsed. The relationship between this Sumerian cosmological framework and the later traditions that inherited it is one of the most significant threads in the history of human thought, and it is one that mainstream scholarship has increasingly taken seriously. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic discovered in 1849 at Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh and translated in 1876, is a direct descendant of Sumerian cosmological tradition, and it describes the creation of the firmament in terms that echo and expand what the Sumerian tablets recorded. In the Enuma Elish, the god Marduk defeats the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, the direct successor to the Sumerian Namu, and splits her body in two. From one half, he makes the earth. From the other half, he makes the sky. The waters of Tiamat's eyes become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The upper half of her body, arched above the earth, holds back the upper waters. Gates are set in place to prevent those waters from escaping. The dome is sealed. The middle realm is established. And in that middle realm, between the sealed dome above and the earth below, the gods take up their stations and existence begins. This is the same architectural vision as the Sumerian original, translated into Babylonian political mythology, with Marduk replacing Enlil as the central organizing figure. The cosmological framework is identical. The dome is still there. The upper ocean is still there. The middle realm is still populated. The gates are still the mechanism through which heaven and earth exchange their substances. The ancient Near Eastern cosmology scholar Paul Kaiser has described this entire framework as a cradle cosmology, suggesting it represents the original human attempt to systematize the structure of existence, and that its influence spread far beyond Mesopotamia into virtually every major civilization of the ancient world. The firmament appears in Genesis. The upper waters appear in the Psalms. The concept of seven heavens stacked above each other, a late development of the original Sumerian framework that described three domes, each made of a different precious stone, appears in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic cosmological tradition. The incantation texts of the late Sumerian period explicitly state, Animin bi ki imin bai. The heavens are seven, the earths are seven, a cosmological structure that echoed down through millennia of religious thought across three of the world's major traditions. The ziggurats, those massive stepped temple towers that defined the urban landscape of Mesopotamian cities, were understood in this cosmological context as physical bridges between the layers. The gap between heaven and earth was bridged by ziggurats, which supported stairways that allowed gods to descend from the heavenly realm into the earth. The buildings were not merely temples. They were cosmological architecture, physical structures designed to connect the inhabited middle realm to the divine regions above it. What makes the Sumerian cosmological system remarkable when examined with modern eyes is not that it matches modern science. It does not. The earth is not a flat disk. The sky is not a tin dome. There is no ocean above the atmosphere. What makes it remarkable is something more subtle and more interesting. The internal consistency with which it describes a universe, the specific and detailed way in which it populates every layer of that universe with beings adapted to their environments, and the degree to which it treats the space between the earth and the sky not as an empty void, but as the most important zone in existence. The middle realm, the Lil, the atmosphere, the space of Enlil's breath, was where everything that mattered to the Sumerians happened. It was where the sun traveled,